So I had an amazing charity shop find last year. For just under £5 I found the entire Death Note manga collection. I honestly couldn't believe my luck. My own personal theory on why this manga collection ended up in a charity shop is that a mum cleared out her child's room without permission. I joked to my family that mum will probably never live that mistake down now. Although I suppose some good came out of that mistake as it led to the creation of this hopefully informative video. This was the first manga collection that I ever read in full or even owned. I don't think I've ever read anything else as quickly as I did this collection. My plan was to sell it originally, but I decided that I needed to read it before I did so. I am so glad I did decide to read it because this tale of arrogance, justice and death had me captivated. Because I enjoyed this manga so much, I really wanted to create an analysis or review type video on it. Despite loving the manga, I still will be selling it in the future as I don't think I need to reread it. I have a really good memory when it comes to this type of thing, and if I want to revisit the story in the future, I will watch the anime. However, I was struggling to come up with a new way to analyse or tackle something in this franchise that has not been covered before. I mean, this series is probably the most popular anime and manga series. A couple months after I'd finished the manga series, I was thinking about my high school English lessons. Bear with me here, but I distinctly remember learning about Macbeth. Most English high school students will have covered this play at some point in their education. As I was thinking about Macbeth, I remembered Aristotle's key theory of the tragic hero, and I thought I could relate this to Death Note. This would be quite an interesting way to look at Light's character in the series. There are a few articles and even a Reddit thread that explore this, but I wanted to create my own unique video discussing this topic. I've always loved applying the tragic hero concept to Macbeth, so I'm going to really enjoy making this video. This video will also allow me to retrospectively look back at my time with the manga in the future. Just a few quick things before we begin. There will be spoilers for the manga and by extension the anime. This analysis will be primarily based upon the manga. However, I will be utilising footage and images from all types of Death Note content. I just wanted to add a bit of visual flair to my analysis. Furthermore, I am going to do my best to include both sides of the argument, so it will include points for Light being a tragic hero and points against this idea. I'll give my own personal opinion towards the end of the video, so let's begin. The main piece of work from Aristotle I will be focusing on is the Poetics, in which he outlines his ideas on tragedy. By utilising this piece of work, I will be able to explain some of the key terms he utilised in relation to tragedy. I apologise in advance for any dodgy pronunciations, but remember this is ancient Greek terminology. So it is important to point out a little bit of history about the academic text itself. The Poetics originated somewhere between 335 BC and 350 BC. It is one of the earliest surviving works based on dramatic theory. The text explores storytelling in general, but also focuses upon how tragedy impacted audiences. Although Aristotle's work is quite hard to utilise or interpret in the modern day. The Poetics is taken from Aristotle's lecture work and is only a surviving portion of a much longer piece of work. Also, it is clearly subjected to some translation issues as it is from the ancient Greek era. However, Aristotle's work is one of the most prominent explorations of tragedy. Thus, it is key to exploring if Light could be considered a tragic hero within Death Note. So Aristotle highlighted 6 main elements of tragedy. These are plot, character, thought, dictation, song, and spectacle. Plot was the soul of tragedy for Aristotle. For him, it was the main avenue to present the narrative of a hero's fall from fortune to misfortune. If this element fails, it is unlikely that the tragic text will be effective. Aristotle then argued that character holds the second place of importance. Baxter 2007 explains how Aristotle views this element. As he explains, characters manifest themselves in the kinds of decisions they make, especially those decisions or mistakes that precipitate tragic suffering, and in the way they cope with the consequences. Character, in this view, is inherently dynamic. It can be fundamentally altered or shaped by crucial choices made at key moments, and this remains true even in the face of the most implacable fate. Aristotle utilises the metaphor of a painting to highlight why characters are behind plot. He explains that the most beautiful colours laid on confusely will not give as much pleasure as the chalk outline of a portrait. 2008. Thought is basically the moral or message behind the play. For example, the Macbeth play warns audiences on the dangers of giving in to temptation and ambition like the main character does. The fourth element, diction, is the writing behind the tragedy text, so acting elements are not taken into account here. Song is not completely relevant, but it is the melody or pattern of speech utilised. Some scholars have adapted this idea to include traditional music as well. I mean, if you wanted to look at the Death Note musical, I suppose you could utilise this idea a bit more. Spectacle is what we now deem special effects, or visuals employed in the play or visual texts. Aristotle also briefly mentions the unity of action and time. The unity of time means that a play or tragedy will usually take course over a brief period of time. This is usually 24 hours or sometimes even 12 hours. This unity is not mentioned much in the Poetics, but he does briefly refer to it. Aristotle did, however, highlight how the unity of action was important to creating a good tragedy, as he argued that a singular plot that only features essential elements is key to tragic texts. For this video, there are some vital Greek tragedy terms that I need to explain. The first is the tragic hero. This idea is somewhat hard to effectively pin down as everyone will view a character's actions differently. However, Aristotle defines this idea by eliminating particular characteristics that a tragic hero cannot have. The tragic figure cannot be completely virtuous or utterly evil. These opposing characteristics would not effectively present the tragic elements to the audience. Instead, a tragic hero must fall somewhere between these two opposite ends to the spectrum. A tragic hero will start off with strong morals but will have a hamartia. A hamartia is basically a fatal flaw or weakness within a tragic hero. This fatal flaw can be a number of things such as hubris, arrogance, or even competitiveness. The next term, peripeteia, means a change of circumstances which fundamentally shifts a character's world or fortune. This is sometimes referred to or translated as reversal. Anagnorisis is a recognition or critical discovery made by one of the characters. This is often very closely linked with the peripeteia. As peripeteia and anagnorisis arise more intense emotions of grief and terror. Bremer, 1969. Pathos can be defined as moments of extreme suffering or emotion. Aristotle argues that this is the bedrock of tragedy, Baxter 2007. And finally, catharsis is a Greek word meaning purification or cleansing. Within dramatic art, this term describes the emotional cleansing that sometimes is depicted in a play as occurring for more than one of its characters. The tragic characters are often punished for their immoral actions by the end of the text, so this gives the audience a sense of catharsis. I briefly wanted to explain some of the issues with utilising this academic text. So as mentioned before, the Poetics is quite confusing to utilise. This is mainly due to how it was recorded and how the larger piece of work was lost to time. However, there is a substantial amount of modern-day work exploring his ideas. These more up-to-date sources really helped in creating this video. Although this also means that there is a large variety of interpretations and debates based upon Aristotle's work. So you may not entirely agree with the opinions expressed by the scholars I utilised or even myself. Aristotle's work is heavily influenced by the black and white moral codes of his ancient Greek society. In the current era, there is often more grey or nuanced depictions of tragedy or moral issues. Death Note is a key example of this, so some of Light's character will not completely fit into Aristotle's theoretical perspective. I also wanted to briefly mention that I came across a few downright archaic views of race and women within Aristotle's work. I mean, I think most people would expect that type of content considering how old the work is, but I wanted to mention it even if it is not completely relevant to the topic at hand. In order to explore if Light could be deemed a tragic hero, many of these terms and concepts will be utilised to analyse his character. I also wanted to utilise a commonly accepted literary tragic hero to compare him against. Macbeth's character has clear similarities to Light, so I wanted to use this classic play to reinforce or challenge certain points I make. So I need to establish a plot explanation for those who have not seen Death Note. I will also do this for Macbeth, as the tragic hero-based play will help me illustrate Death Note's elements of tragedy. I will not go into extreme depth, but I will go through each of the key narrative points. At the beginning of Death Note, we see both a young student and a mythical Shinigami share their individual dislike of the worlds they reside in. It is also revealed that the Shinigami dropped something called a Death Note in the human world, and Light was the one to find it. The Death Note book contains a list of rules that explain how it works. The major rule being that if a human name is written within its pages, that person will die. Despite being cynical of how it works, Light keeps the notebook and begins to use it. Eventually, the Shinigami introduces himself to Light as Ryuk. After they discuss their backgrounds to each other, Light explains how he wants to create a new world by utilising the Death Note. By eliminating criminals, he wants to rid the world of evil. Light continues to write criminals' names within the notebook, and eventually the wider world and the International Police Organisation become aware of the unexplained criminal deaths. An anonymous detective referred to as L suggests that the killings are being committed by a mass murderer. This unknown killer is labelled Kira by the public. By cleverly tricking Kira, L narrows down their location to Japan. This sets off a wider chain of events as L attempts to discover Light's identity, and Light must discreetly keep his identity a secret in order to create his new world. There are many interesting plot developments and further characters that aid in this cat and mouse battle, but I don't think it is relevant to explain the whole narrative. Eventually, Light manages to successfully kill L while his Kira identity begins to receive overwhelming public support. However, Light must then compete with two of L's successors as they continue his goals to stop Kira. I honestly recommend you either read the manga or watch the anime series if you are interested from this synopsis. There's so many more interesting characters that I have not really touched upon because I would basically have to explain the entire plot in extreme detail. One of my personal favourite characters that I did not touch upon is Misa. Her dynamic with Light was very unusual but intriguing to watch. Plus, I think the moral issues this series delves into is quite important even if you don't really enjoy the characters. So now that we are all on the same level with Death Note, I need to establish a key understanding of the famous Scottish play. Now, Macbeth is quite a well-known text, but a brief plot summary will help support the analysis of Light Yagami's character. The play begins with the titular Macbeth encountering three witches alongside his friend Banquo. This gang of witches present three different prophecies. These are that Macbeth will become Thane of Cawdor, Macbeth will then become king, and then Banquo's children will be kings as well. The first prophecy becomes true as Macbeth is named Thane of Cawdor by the king. Macbeth's wife learns of the prophecies and how the first one has already come true, and then tries to convince her husband to murder the current king to fulfill the second prophecy. The king conveniently comes to stay at Macbeth's castle. Macbeth is heavily conflicted on the murder plot, but eventually does murder the king in his sleep. After this, the king's children flee, and Macbeth is now named king. Now that the second prophecy has been fulfilled, Macbeth becomes increasingly concerned on if Banquo's one will come to pass. He hires a group to kill Banquo and his son, but his son manages to escape. At a public banquet, Macbeth becomes hysterical because he sees Banquo's ghost, which leads him to seek out the witches again. They present further prophecies to Macbeth by conjuring up some spirits. The prophecies warn Macbeth to be wary of a rival nobleman Macduff that opposes his kingship. However, they also prophesy that Macbeth is incapable of being harmed by any man born by a woman. They also claim that until Birnam Wood comes to Dunsinane Castle, Macbeth will be safe. These almost impossible predictions falsely put Macbeth at ease. He then orders for Macduff's family to be murdered, which arguably causes Macduff to retaliate. Stricken with sleepwalking and guilt from her actions, Lady Macbeth then kills herself. After he finds out about his wife's death, a messenger informs Macbeth that the wood is in fact moving towards the castle. Macduff's army has utilised branches from Birnam Wood to shield themselves. Thus, one of the prophecies has become true again. Macbeth and his supporters engage with Macduff's army, and both of these leaders engage in combat on the battlefield. Within their heated battle, Macduff reveals that he was born by cesarean instead of traditionally being born. Macbeth now realises he has been deceived by the witches but chooses to die fighting instead of being a coward. Macduff then kills him and the rightful heir of Duncan is named king. In most circles, Macbeth acts as the definitive example of a tragic hero. His ambition leads him to become increasingly crueler and more arrogant. Some of the tragedy comes from the fact that he is influenced from outside sources such as his wife or the supernatural witches. The question the tragedy raises is that would Macbeth have actually gone through with these ideas if the figures had not motivated him to do so? If the witches had not presented the prophecies to him and his wife had not persuaded him to go through with them, would he have done it? I don't think there is a clear answer in this regard, but it does certainly establish his character as a tragic hero figure. Before the end of the play, we even see Macbeth's character express some regret of his actions, even if he does resort to go down fighting. Again, I would highly recommend seeking out this play or an adaptation of it if you have not seen it already. The older writing style is quite hard to keep up with sometimes though, so bear that in mind. Like Misa and the other characters within Death Note, I did not completely go into depth with characters in Macbeth. Lady Macbeth's character is a lot more interesting than what was represented in the brief plot summary. Now that we have a good context basis, I really want to dig into how Death Note incorporates elements of tragedy. Even though the Death Note manga is not the medium that Aristotle was exploring, I do think it contains several of his elements of tragedy theory. This may not originally have been intended by the franchise's creators, but I personally think it is an extremely interesting way to critically analyse this popular narrative. The first two tragedy elements are clearly evident within Death Note's manga. Audiences consistently praise its phenomenal plot and storytelling. I mean, one of the major criticisms of the 2017 Netflix film adaptation was that it failed to capture the concise and enthralling plot present in both the manga and the anime. Part of me is imagining Aristotle reading the manga and then the Netflix film. Like, do you think he would kick off at the Netflix film for not using the manga's clear plot? I think he would. Anyway, character is also one of the manga's strong suits. I mean, I originally made this video because of how interesting I found Light Yagami's character. I think he has become one of my favourite characters at the moment. His overall personality and his manipulation tactics are so interesting to analyse and look at overall. Even some of the minor or side characters are extremely unique and well developed, even if they only have a small part in the ongoing narrative. I would argue that Death Note's manga heavily reinforces Aristotle's painting metaphor, as the plot works as the chalk outline of the painting and the characters as the beautiful colours to craft this tragedy. Thought, dictation and spectacle are definitely a part of the Death Note manga. I would argue that there are several different moral messages throughout the entire narrative. For example, Light's death at the end warns the audience to not let their arrogance blind them to their oppositions. Light foolishly believes that Mello and Nia stand no chance against him after he successfully killed L, so he is simultaneously subjected to bad luck and then makes careless mistakes in his plans. Furthermore, the manga highlights the danger in letting your moral beliefs control you. Honestly, I think this franchise's frequent look into this dark moral conundrum can lead to multiple different messages. Within the manga, dictation is absolutely present. I don't think anyone can argue against the fact that the manga has some absolutely fantastic writing. Spectacle is arguably a part of the manga's images as well. Oftentimes when this manga is adapted for the screen, there is a large amount of special effects or interesting visuals employed. Now, song is the only tragedy element that is not really present within the manga. I mean, it is in some adaptations.
What would I do if I got inside his head? Thought I killed instead. Could it be? Possibly. I'll catch him when I look through his eyes and see what he sees, and then improvise until I can learn what puts him at ease.
Also, the manga series is quite complex and does not completely fit into the unity of action or time theories. The plot takes place over several years instead of a singular day as Aristotle suggested. The manga also contains multiple characters and numerous amounts of plot elements. One could argue that this complex but multi-layered plot does not conform to Aristotle's unity of time or action. However, I would counter this by arguing that it does fit into the unity of action at the very least. There are very few sequences or events that you could remove from the narrative that would not cause the chain of events that Light's character is a part of to break down. In fact, some of Shakespeare's work, which is often highly regarded to be a part of the tragedy definition, do not conform to either of these unities. I would argue that there are multiple peripeteia or anagonoresis moments within Death Note. There are several reveals and twists running throughout Light's entire story. Obviously, ones towards the end of the narrative lean more heavily into the tragedy elements. In Light's final plan to defeat L's successors, there is both a change in fortune and a recognition of how his plan has failed. After Light meets Nia in the warehouse, it is revealed how Nia's team managed to switch Mikami's Death Note for a fake one. Light then scrambles to find a way to kill everyone who has now discovered his identity. So now that we have explored Death Note's tragedy elements, we can see if this makes Light a tragic hero. Now, the argument for Light being a tragic hero arguably falls down to how you view his character's actions at the beginning. A concept like this, where you can kill someone by writing their name down, is obviously subjected to major moral debates and conversations. How you personally view Light's early ideology will impact if you find his downfall tragic or not. Light clearly begins the manga as someone who has a high level of morality, even if you disagree with his ideology and how he wants to go about it. Light's original plan is to rid the world of criminals and leave behind people he deems decent. Of course, this morality is quite extreme and ignores some of the nuances involved in why people become criminals in the first place. Even though Light's goals are extreme, there is a strong moral compass behind it. It's like that famous saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Thus, the tragedy arises when we see an esteemed student pave this dark path with righteous intentions. At the beginning of the manga, Light is one of Japan's top students. He is also extremely popular within school. And on top of this, his family is really well respected, as his father is the head of the Tokyo police force. There are clear parallels between Light's high social standing and Macbeth's high nobility. Aristotle even argued that tragedies should focus upon characters like Light or Macbeth falling from their previously high position. Of course, Light is not royalty like Macbeth, but I would argue that his well-respected status is more suited to a modern-day tragedy. I don't think many of us could rival Light's extraordinary intelligence, but we are able to relate to his motivations and ambitions even if we don't agree with his overall plan. Light's family status and extreme intellect emphasises the tragedy of his eventual downfall. In a world where Light didn't find the Death Note, he could have utilised his intelligence to become a police chief like his father. Or he could have even possibly worked alongside L at some point. When Light has lost his memories after releasing ownership of the Death Note, we get to see a tragic glimpse of what could have been.
Would I punish evildoers and criminals if I could kill by just seeing a name and face? Is that what I'd do if I had that sort of power? I mean, it's true that there are lots of people around that the world could frankly do without, but I don't think I'd become a murderer just to change the world. Surely I wouldn't do that. No, I'm thinking too hard about this. There's no way anyone could murder so many people and not have any memory of it.
What's wrong? You've been staring at me for the last 2 minutes. Wait, let me guess. You must be annoyed because I'm the only one eating cake at the moment, am I right?
No, that's not it.
Here.
At one point, Aristotle highlights how fear and pity emotions are emphasised when characters who have a close or familial relationship cause harm to each other within tragedies. Light does this frequently throughout Death Note's narrative. He establishes a rival-like friendship with L but eventually ends up murdering him. He takes advantage of Misa's love for him to achieve his own ends. There are even a few more female characters that he takes advantage of in a similar way. He even has an odd but friend-like relationship with Ryuk which eventually ends in murder. I think one of the most tragic familiar scenes is when his dad dies. Light is so corrupted by the Death Note and his Kira persona that he only cares about his father writing Mello's name. Instead of saying goodbye to his own father on his deathbed, he is wrapped up in defeating L's successors. This scene just adds another layer of tragedy to Light's overall character. I personally believe that the Death Note does corrupt Light to some degree. However, it is definitely hard to see where the line is between his own identity and the Kira identity he crafts for himself under the Death Note's influence. This unclear line is what makes Light a tragic hero to me. Aristotle argued that a tragic figure cannot be completely virtuous or utterly evil. Anyone who utilises the Death Note to murder someone could not be considered completely virtuous. But Light is attempting to use the murder weapon to achieve a better world, so I don't think he is completely evil either. The undefined impact of the Death Note debatably muddies the water in regards to Light's accountability. Remember that when Light explains how he first came to utilise the Death Note, he states that, but that notebook has a power that makes you want to try it. This idea is further reinforced when Light releases his ownership over the Death Note and we get to see him return to his early self. If Light is corrupted by the Death Note's power, is he responsible for his actions after he is corrupted? Again, this does not have a clear black and white answer, but the tragedy is built upon this grey area. If we take a look at the Macbeth tragedy, there is a similar debate on if the supernatural witches and his wife influenced Macbeth's actions. Obviously, I'm not saying that Macbeth is completely blameless, but there is a shade of grey involved. A similar case can be made for Light's character as well. My own personal opinion is that both of these tragic figures are still largely responsible for their own actions. However, I view both of their downfalls as tragic due to the mitigating factors involved. Unlike Macbeth, early Light does not just want power. One of his main motivations is to improve the rotten world that has become overrun with crime. Obviously, there is some motivation to obtain power as he wants to become god of the new world. But there is also some motivation to improve society as a whole, even if his motivation is incredibly flawed. I mean, he begins by killing extreme criminals that are causing danger to people's lives. A key example is the criminal who held several children hostage. The severe issue arises when Light gradually begins to justify his escalating immoral actions. He begins to justify killing less severe criminals or even innocent people to protect his identity. It's the classic does the end justify the means argument. Light clearly believes it does and gradually becomes more and more corrupted with his morals. In his attempts to not be caught out by L and ultimately achieve his new world, Light is increasingly willing to murder innocent people who get in his way. His motivations turn from creating a better world to sacrificing people who do not agree with his ideology. He also becomes obsessed with defeating L and the others who resist his beliefs. This is where I think the manga's tragedy stems from, as it follows a person who originally wanted to create a better world who increasingly becomes worse than the people he is getting rid of to improve said world. Light definitely has a hamartia which most tragic hero figures have. I would argue that arrogance, competitiveness and hubris are his tragic flaws, and the Death Note severely emphasises these qualities in his Kira persona. These three flaws ultimately lead to his downfall in the end. His competitiveness does eventually allow him to win against L. However, his competitiveness combines with his other two flaws as he is facing off against L's successors instead of focusing on his new world. I think this heightens the tragedy surrounding Light's character. Due to his overwhelming desire to win, he murders the person he is competing with. This is even more tragic as L originally deemed Light as the first friend he ever had, and they obviously connect on a deeper level. Speaking from a personal perspective, Light's death really did upset me. I had to reflect upon why this death impacted me as much as it did. I'm not one to get too emotional about fictional deaths, but this one really got to me for some reason. At the point in the narrative when Light dies, his character is an out-of-control serial killer, even if he is impacted by the Death Note. He has routinely murdered innocent people and taken advantage of those around him. So why was I upset that he died? Light is charismatic in a way and a unique character to follow, but I would not usually be upset when an immoral character eventually dies. There definitely is a sense of catharsis as he's being subjected to the death he has given to countless innocents and criminals. However, this didn't stop the upsetting or tragic nature of his death. I came to the conclusion that I must have found him to be a tragic hero. His death is quite tragic and emotional as he basically goes down like a coward. His manga death isn't as peaceful or as calm as it is in the anime version. He is screaming for Ryuk to help him and how he doesn't want to die. I mean, regardless of what his character has done, it is still upsetting to see someone like that. I mean, even if you're relieved that Light has been defeated, there must be some small part of you that finds Light's desperate begging tragic in some way. Even one of the characters at the warehouse, which is one of Light's co-workers and friends, pities him despite him attempting to murder him. I basically felt the same way as Matsuda's character did. I liked Light's character, so I felt a bit of pathos when he died. Therefore, there are many arguments for why Light can be deemed a tragic hero. I also wanted to cover the other side of the coin and represent why some people may not view him as tragic. I may not personally agree, but I hope I can effectively outline why some people may disagree with me. I think Light's early moral code is the main aspect that some may argue that contradicts Aristotle's tragic hero idea. The best part about Death Note's themes and story is that there is no clear interpretation that is absolutely correct. I know that so far I have argued that Light is a tragic hero, but there are clear points against this idea. I mean, some readers will view Light as an evil character straight from the beginning of the manga. He is outright murdering people at the beginning with his newfound power regardless of the intent behind it. Essentially, he is a mass murderer or serial killer. One could argue that Light cannot fit into Aristotle's ideas as he is outright evil. One of the manga's writers even supports this idea by stating that, "Personally, I only look at it as Light is very evil, L is slightly evil, and only Soichiro is good." Froelich 2012, page 149. If you agree with the creator's perspective, Light could not be a tragic hero as he is utterly evil. Remember that Aristotle highlighted that a tragic hero must not be completely virtuous or utterly evil. Instead, they must fall somewhere in between these two extremes. I mean, at the very beginning of the manga, the second person he kills was only really harassing someone. Obviously, harassing someone isn't nice, but it isn't something you should kill someone over. So obviously I can understand if someone views Light as evil from the very beginning. Although, I think the manga and series is a bit more nuanced than this. Death Note's narrative heavily explores the blurring boundaries between justice and murder. This may contradict the creator's intention, but I see it more as a morally grey character eventually becoming more and more evil. We as viewers get to see how Light gradually becomes worse than the criminals he is executing. The Death Note series is almost like a character study upon Light. We as audience members can sympathise with his early desires to change the corrupt world, even if we do not agree with how he wants to achieve it. Then we get to experience how this previously popular high achiever with a strong moral compass takes his ambitions way too far. He becomes corrupted by the power he has obtained and attempts to assert his superiority to L and those who oppose him. For me, the point where Light crosses the line into tragic evilness is when he's killing people to escape his identity being discovered. These people's only crime is disagreeing with Light's ideology, and they are murdered for it. In particular, the murder of Ray Pember, the FBI agent, and his wife represent Light's major turning point, or the point of no return, if you will. Many people will argue that these actions are far too evil to be considered tragic, even if he is impacted by the Death Note's power. However, there are some clear similarities to the tragic hero within Macbeth. Throughout the play, Macbeth murders several innocent people in his quest to obtain power. I think you could draw a clear parallel from Macbeth's Banquo and Death Note's L. Both are friends with the main tragic hero figure and eventually end up opposing their ideologies. Then both of them are murdered by said tragic hero. I find it interesting how they both leave behind relatives that eventually surpass them. Another interesting similarity is the influence of supernatural forces on both of the tragic heroes in each text. Macbeth is arguably influenced by his wife and the supernatural witches, whereas the supernatural notebook has an unclear influence upon users like Light. One could argue that there is more evidence for Macbeth being influenced than there is for Light. I mean, the witches do purposely deceive Macbeth, and Lady Macbeth does persuade and manipulate him, whereas Ryuk doesn't really interfere and sometimes even helps Light with his goals. And as stated before, the influence of the Death Note is not clearly outlined, so there are points for and against Light being similar to Macbeth. In conclusion, the Death Note manga definitely has many of Aristotle's elements of tragedy. I myself would even suggest that the Death Note manga should be added to the canon of famous tragedy-related texts. As a protagonist, Light Yagami has many tragic hero qualities. He has several tragic flaws, a strong moral compass that is eventually corrupted, a downfall, and close relationship betrayals that add pathos. There are arguments against this idea, but I think the manga's tragedy elements and the multiple tragic qualities he has as a character makes him a tragic hero. Despite my personal opinion, I hope I have managed to be able to cover both sides of the argument. So I wanted to thank you for watching this video. I'm interested to hear your opinions on this idea. This video took a long time for me to make, so I'd appreciate it if you could share or recommend it to people you think would enjoy this type of content. See you!